This is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York, for the second Sunday of Christmas. My name is Cameron Miller. This is a reflection on Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus 24, 1 through 12. The poem Beginning by Leah Perpua, and John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. In the beginning, it's all about how we conjure it, says the poet. In the beginning was the Word with God, says John. In the beginning, the feminine holy hovered over creation to find the single best place to reside, says Ben Sira in his book Ecclesiasticus. I don't know anything about the beginning, but New Year's has me nostalgic and reflective again. Recently I told you about Theoda, and today I want to stretch back a few years before I knew her. It was when I was 27 and a curate straight out of seminary in Lafayette, Indiana. Now, you have to realize I had a philosophy major in college. I was a passionate existentialist and social activist. And then I attended a renegade seminary, Episcopal seminary, but even with that, was just barely able to tolerate the intellectual and social confines of the church. In short, although the Episcopal Church is exceedingly roomy, I felt like a black shirt and a white collar was a very tight fit right from the beginning. Unlike a lot of my classmates, whose ordinations were the culmination of long-held dreams and ambition, I entered priesthood one step at a time, tiptoeing even. As soon as I arrived at the church in Lafayette, the very tired rector took off for a month's vacation. It was the sink or swim method. All I can say, looking back, is that there were some incredibly gracious people in that congregation. And one of the most gracious of them all was named Sally. Sally was only a few years older than me and had already given birth to 4 children. In addition, she adopted 4 more. Each adopted child had some kind of disability and were also, I think, biracial. 8 children. 8 children. I will never forget what she said to me when I left that parish at the end of my 2-year internship. I was newly married and about to become a rector for the first time. And Sally told me that her prayer for me was that I would have children, lots and lots of children. But I don't want kids, I said. You need a lot of kids, she replied. Why? They'll stretch you. And you need a lot of stretching. Oh, how she was right, both about having kids and about me. I met Sally on the very first day in my office at that church in Lafayette. I was unpacking my meager office items, a few mementos from seminary, and I can still see Sally leaning against the table and talking all about her family. At the time, Sally was emerging from a sojourn among evangelicals and charismatic Episcopalians, something that seemed like the other side of the moon to me. And even though I was the one wearing a clerical collar, she spoke freely and with great confidence about the Bible and faith and prayer and Jesus, all things that I choked on. What would Jesus do was not in the nomenclature yet. But if it had been, she would have been telling me what Jesus would do and therefore what she was doing to be like Jesus. Sally was remarkably enthusiastic and able to tell me in detail what God was doing in her life. Now realize, please, I was literally days out of the seminary womb, a place feathered with overly rational scholasticism and academic arrogance. As I listened to Sally, but not really listened as I have learned to do since, I was flabbergasted to hear her speak about God answering her prayers in the same tone of voice that she would describe grocery shopping. When she confided in me about her prayers for a microwave oven, which was a relatively new consumer item at the time, I blurted out with indignation, "Do you think God really cares if you have a microwave? Why would God give you a microwave and allow children in the Horn of Africa to starve?" I may have used an expletive. I often did in those days. Sally looked at me, appeared totally unaffected by what I thought was the incongruity of her prayer for a microwave and another mother's starving baby, and responded, "Well, yes, I think God cares." And then she told me exactly how God does such things. I was blinded by my arrogance, I can see now, or I would have been able to recognize that my assertions about God could, or about what God could or could not do, were every bit as ridiculous as Sally's, probably even more so. In 2008, some 30 years after Lafayette, I began raising money for an organization in El Salvador. It was for a project to support a health worker named Gloria, who I had come to know and respect, and whose focus was on educating and raising the self-esteem of teenage girls and young women. So in this project, I made a list of friends and acquaintances from former congregations that I had served, and I sent them all a description of Gloria's work. In 3 days, I had a check from Sally, one that turned out to be one of the largest contributions I would receive, and that's saying something. Sally and I had not seen one another for at least a decade then. And what I realized as I reflected on it was that I was too blind to see when I was younger, and regardless of whether, and what I realized then that I was too blind to see when I was younger, was that regardless of whether God answered prayers for a microwave or not, Sally was one of the answers to God's prayers for us. Now hold that thought for a minute. God's prayers for us. You will not be surprised to know, if you've listened to me at all, that I continue to discount the idea that God provides microwaves or parking spaces, no matter how earnestly we might pray for them. Even so, I do believe that God is intimately connected and influential in this world. Today, years of humbling experience later, and years of befuddling life in between, my sense is that God is an absolute mystery. And all of us are condemned to being mystics in search of an encounter with that mystery. In fact, that's what I would say when somebody asks me how we know anything about God, which is that we get to encounter God. We don't get knowledge about God. We get an experience, not a theory. We get a bump in the dark, not a how-to manual. These days, I don't theorize much about God at all. It is enough to simply encounter the holy in whatever way it presents itself, and to let those moments influence which direction that we put one foot in front of the other. I am able to say with some certainty that I'm able to say now with some certainty that I didn't have when I knew Sally, that every single one of us has had an encounter with God, or the holy, or the mystical, or whatever doggone thing we want to call it. Many of us are shy when it comes to talking about encountering God, and most of us do not have the confidence to talk out loud about our encounters. But that does not mean that we haven't had them. Such encounters can be intellectual, can be intuitive, can be visionary, can be communal, can be sacramental, can be even tactile. There are all kinds of encounters with the holy. They are not measurable, predictable, definable, or replicable in a laboratory. Instead, they are utterly subjective and more often subtle than dramatic, more often quiet than awesome, and within the ordinary more than the extraordinary. Let me leave you with one homely example that you've encountered. An ordinary encounter with the holy, with God. It is an encounter that most of us in this community have had, and you may never have thought of it as an encounter with God. But you could, you might. I would even recommend it. Think about baptism for a moment. Think about your baptism, even though you probably don't remember it. In that moment when we were baptized, we held hands with a first century Ethiopian eunuch, with a Roman senator's wife, with a 6th century French peasant, with a 12th century South Indian farmer, with a 17th century West African slave, with a 19th century American robber baron, with a 20th century Russian Pentecostal, with a 21st century Chinese Episcopalian. By this massive circle of hand-holding that has taken place across time and over continents and through cultures, we have infused history and even our very own lives with the presence of Jesus of Nazareth. Through baptism, you and I actually become the body that God can use to walk around in the world and to be involved in life as we live it, through which God actually influences things. We can actually, you and I, can actually become the answer to God's prayers for us, as Sally has likely been so many times. It seems so very ordinary as to not constitute an encounter with God. It seems so ordinary as to not be holy, but that's the point. The presence of God is ordinary, and God is present in the ordinary. Through the practice of our baptisms, we are answering God's prayers for us, and in the process encountering God in the ordinary of our lives. In the beginning, we were baptized, and we became agents of God's love. We have had encounters with God ever since. We just didn't know how to claim it, or to name it, or to recognize its simple presence within the ordinary of our lives. Happy New Year. And may your New Year's be filled with great peace,